أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على خير خلقه ونور عرشه أفضل الأنبياء والمرسلين حبيب إله العالمين المصطفى محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين. Assalamu alaikum brothers and sisters, and welcome to our first of four sessions covering the science of hadith. So the main purpose of this series, like the previous one, is to foster the spirit of informed research. And besides hadiths being an important source of Islamic law and belief, it is also a very fascinating field for its richness of material, variety of subjects, and depth of knowledge. The vast majority of controversial issues we have also stem from the hadith literature and not from the Quran. In comparison to hadith, the Quran is a relatively shorter and more concise text, and at least the authenticity of the Quran has been verified, whereas hadiths have to undergo a systemic and rigorous application of the principles of criticism, not only to verify them, but also to remain untainted by bias. Before we begin tonight's session, I just wanted to give due credit to everyone who contributed to bringing together this event, especially Ali Hamoud, Ali Safdari, Brother Muhammad Rezlan, and Zara Maki. And of course, my team, including Ali Rikabi, Nisar Ahmadi, Zainab al-Naqib, and Farama Kassira. Today, we are honored to have Sayyid Ali Amran all the way from Canada, who will shed some light on the area. He's a student of knowledge who has been studying in the seminary for about 8 years now. Without further ado, Brother Ali, thank you for being amongst us.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for the introduction. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear viewers, brothers and sisters. First of all, I just want to make a disclaimer. This is probably the earliest I've woken up since COVID began. Because before COVID began, we were waking up for school in Qom and going to classes, but ever since the schools shut down and stuff, I've been sleeping in quite late. So if you see me slipping here and there, it's probably because I haven't slept too long or haven't woken up this early in a while. But anyways, inshallah.
I should have mentioned that as well.
Pardon?
It's 6 a.m. by the way in Canada right now. We were supposed to have the event at 8:30, but that would have been 5:30 in Canada, and it's too early.
Yeah. And anyways, alhamdulillah, so let's begin. We have around 4 sessions that we want to cover basically an overall, an overview of the hadith studies, hadith sciences. And as we've mentioned already, this is going to be an introduction and an overview. We're going to try to touch on some technical things, but not in a very complicated manner, hopefully. Just so people get an overview of what the sciences cover and how much depth and how many areas there are for further exploration and further investigation. And inshallah, if we even have time by the end of the 3rd or 4th session, I may even touch upon some contemporary ways of looking at hadith and so on. So let me just you guys can see the slides, right?
Yes, we can see them.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
So let's begin, and let me just keep an eye on the time as well. So let's begin with first of all, I want to define exactly what does hadith in Arabic actually mean before we get into the whole subject of hadith sciences. See, the word in Arabic has obviously a wide range of meanings. You can have its linguistic meaning, then it has technical meanings. Linguistically, it could mean an event, an incident, anything to do with something occurring. And historically, there have been debates on why did the word hadith come to be attributed to the prophetic sayings or the sayings of the AhlulBayt, right? And there are some theories about this. Some of them say, well, this may have occurred during a period when there were debates going on about the kalam of Allah, the Quran. Okay, is it hadith or is it qadim? This is one theory. We don't actually know why did the word hadith come to be attributed to the sayings of the Prophet and the AhlulBayt. But that is one discussion, one theory that is mentioned out there. But there are also other words that are also used at times for the reports. For example, you may hear the word athar or athar or khabar. You have these different terms. Do they have specific meanings in the are they jargon as well? Do they have specific meanings in the technical sense? Yes. When you read the books of hadith and diraya, the books that investigate these terminologies, you will find that some scholars, especially in the Ahlul Sunnah, scholarship, they have specific meanings when they say the word athar, or when they say the word khabar. For example, when they say khabar, it may mean it's actually just a report from a companion, and it's not really a statement from the Holy Prophet. But anyways, today, nowadays, these sort of divisions are not really known too much by the people, and even in scholarly circles, you'll see that there's not too much, attention paid to these divisions. It's good to know these divisions if you're going to be reading historical works on hadith studies, so you know that if a scholar uses the word khabar, let's say in 3rd century or 4th century, you know what they actually mean. But today, hadith is simply a statement which is attributed to the Prophet. And, this statement, it doesn't have to be a statement, sorry. It can be any sort of report attributed to the Prophet, whether it's his speech or, some of the things that he did, or, describing anything that he's done or said. And likewise, in Shi'i literature, the word hadith is then obviously extended, beyond just the Prophet, and goes on to be applicable to all the ma'sumin, from Lady Fatima al-Zahra salamullah alayha, and all the 12 imams that we have. So that's a very simple explanation of the word hadith. We don't need to get any more technical and complicated than that. So there are a couple of branches that the hadith studies or the hadith sciences, they branch into. Maybe someone can come up with further divisions, but these are the 4 general branches that we have under hadith sciences. Even today in the seminaries, you can probably find yourself focusing on any one of these 4 categories. And what are these? So first and foremost, you have history of hadith. That itself is a whole field. Okay. How did the compilation begin? When did it begin? Was there a ban on hadith, recording and transmitting hadith or not? Who were the individuals? Who were these individuals who were compiling a hadith and so on? Who were the scholars? What were the books? Anything to do with history, basically, of hadith goes into this discussion. Sometimes this historical discussion is also then connected with theological discussions, because for example, someone may say, well, someone may make an argument that well, just like the Prophet had left the Quran, then he also must have encouraged people to compile down the hadith as well, because they may come up with a theological presumption here that the hadiths are also just as important, because that's what's going to also end up guiding the future generations of the Muslim community alongside the Quran. And if he had so much care and attention towards the preservation of the Quran, then he also probably had some attention towards the preservation of his sayings. And then they may go and analyze the historical reports from a different perspective. So yes, even though history on its own, you may be analyzing the different historical reports, but sometimes it can be accompanied with certain theological discussions as well. And then you may have to go and discuss those ideas in some theological class as well. So that's what we generally discuss in history. A second branch of hadith studies is ilm al-rijal. Now, ilm al-rijal is, basically the study of the transmitters, the study of the people who are going to be transmitting a hadith, the narrators, basically. Even the scholars who ended up compiling some of the books of rijal, like they also get studied over here. Who was the scholar who was compiling this book of hadith? We'll mention these when we get to ilm al-rijal, right? Like, for example, Ibn Ghada'iri will be one of the guys we'll discuss. He compiles a book, but he compiles a book on ilm al-rijal, but he himself, people have an issue with, scholars have an issue with him, to say he was too strict and so on. So we'll discuss that. We'll also discuss, the role of ilm al-rijal, like, is it important? Is it needed? Is it not needed? We'll discuss some of the disputes that existed between the Akhbari scholars, the scholars known as there was a group called the Akhbaris, and they rejected the study of ilm al-rijal. Why did they reject it? What was their issue? And then what were the rebuttals against them? Inshallah, we'll cover this briefly as well in the next few sessions. The third section or branch of hadith studies is ilm al-diraya. Now, ilm al-diraya today, unfortunately, even in the seminaries, it's not very much discussed. I think in the seminary also, they'll just tell you to read, I don't know, Ayatollah Jafar Subhani's book or something, and they'll say like that's probably enough. But no, historically, both in the Shi'i and the Sunni tradition, there were some very interesting books written on ilm al-diraya. What is ilm al-diraya? Historically, it is basically a science that discusses the technical jargon, the jargon of hadith, okay, the hadith language. What does sahih mean? Okay, we always use the word, oh, is this hadith sahih? What does sahih even mean? Okay, what does that mean? What does da'if mean? What does mutawatir mean? What does khabar wahid mean? So all of these terminologies, you go and study in ilm al-diraya. And historically also, you also had the study of, how was the transmission, how was the narration transmitted? Okay, was it orally transmitted? Was it written and then somebody, wrote it down? Or was it, found in a storage room or in a marketplace? How was the book or the tradition even found? That also gets discussed in ilm al-diraya. Although today, as I said, like, it's not a very, like, I haven't seen anywhere this course being taught really in the Hawza, in the official curriculum. I haven't seen it being taught. Yeah, but students can study it on their own or read it on their own, or maybe find a teacher or for it. So because it's also not very much discussed at length in the seminary, I'll also not be mentioning too much about it in these 4 sessions. Maybe I'll mention a couple of technical terms like sahih and da'if, which are very common, just to explain what do these terms even mean. Okay, because sahih, the way people understand it, the general public, when they say, is this hadith sahih, their perspective, their understanding is probably saying that, okay, this narration can be attributed to the Prophet 100% without any doubt. Okay, that's the idea people have, but that is not what the technical term actually even means. Okay, and inshallah we'll maybe discuss that in the second or third session. And then the final session, the final branch that we have is fiqh al-hadith. Fiqh al-hadith is basically the study of the content of any tradition. Okay, so, and inshallah when we cover this also in our sessions, I'm going to bring a couple of case studies, real case studies, real ahadith, and show you how scholars have tried to understand them. So this is a study of understanding a hadith, when the Prophet or the Imam said something, and now this saying is reported and recorded in a book. What does this even mean? And once again, inshallah, I hope that people will realize that it's not very easy to just read a statement and then go around copy pasting it and saying, oh, this is what the Imams meant, or this is what the Prophet meant. You can actually open up so much discussion on what does this statement even mean. And sometimes you can get so critical, textually critical with the content, that you may actually end up concluding that there's no way the Imam said this statement. Okay, there are some serious flaws in the way this statement was said or whatever, inshallah. So we'll discuss that also. So these are the 4 branches, and the 4 sessions that I'm going to be covering will basically also, highlight some of these, some of the discussions from these branches. So today, inshallah, we'll be beginning with the first one, which is the history. And the most important discussion that we want to cover in history is the history of the compilation of the hadith. Okay, when were the hadiths compiled? And that's a big topic, even in Western academia as well. So there is this famous statement that is reported many times in the books of hadith studies, which says the first person to compile the hadith was Muhammad bin Shihab al-Zuhri on the orders of Umar bin Abdul Aziz, okay, the Umayyad Khalifa, who was around 99 Hijri or 100 Hijri. So this is a famous statement that is said. And what the impression this gives people is that, okay, so that means there were no hadith compilations, there were no hadith books until 100 Hijri, 100 years after, basically, or give or take, after the Hijrah, that there was literally nothing in the Muslim Ummah. And that's the impression that we get. And actually that's what scholars will defend and argue for as well, on both sides, Sunni and Shias, and we'll see this in the next slide. See, the predominant opinion, okay, the popular predominant opinion, both amongst the Shia scholars and also the Sunni scholars, is that writing down and compiling the hadith was banned during the time of the Khulafa Rashidin specifically, and then they assume it to be the case up until Umar bin Abdul Aziz, who they say lifted the ban, near 100 Hijri, 99 Hijri, 100 Hijri. And their evidence for that is that there are a number of narrations or reports, historical reports that go back to the time of, for example, Abu Bakr or Umar, specifically these two, that seem to indicate that they had an issue with people compiling ahadith and even at sometimes just transmitting it orally. And then that splits up also a further discussion that, okay, was it just the writing down of hadith that was banned, or was also the oral transmission of it banned? Okay. Now, see, the oral transmission of it, it's not very, easy to argue for that, because at the end of the day, people were quoting the Prophet, and people, you're like, are you telling me people didn't quote the Prophet for 100 years? Obviously that's not the case. But there are some discussions, because there are some reports which seem to indicate that Umar, for example, even prevented certain individuals from even orally transmitting a hadith. And then from there, they think that, okay, he must have banned that as well. But, as I said, that's very, very difficult to say that this was like something happening for 100 years and nobody even quoted the Prophet. No. But yes, there is a discussion on writing down hadith and compiling it. And they say, well, we have so many reports, where Umar specifically is literally going out and, telling individuals not to compile a hadith. We have statements that says, the Prophet said you shouldn't compile a hadith. You shouldn't write down what, the statements that I am saying. And then the scholars have analyzed it and they have concluded that yes, there was a ban. And, so now what do we do? If there's a ban for 100 years, and Umar bin Abdul Aziz, they say, was the first one to give the order to compile a hadith, now the scholars have to explain and justify the decision of the Khulafa. Okay, why did they do it? So the Ahlul Sunnah have justifications. I've just mentioned a couple of them. There's actually a few more that they bring as well. I've mentioned like 5 or 6 over here. They bring justifications for why the Khulafa, specifically, as I said, Umar is the main individual involved in these traditions. Why did he ban it, the writing of hadith? And the Shia scholars also bring their explanations for why he would have banned it, or why, Abu Bakr, even there's one narration, very famous one, that seems to indicate that he also had a problem with it. What are their justifications? See, the first justification that these Sunni scholars will give is that, look, they did not, it was a new Muslim community, the Prophet had just passed away, they were occupied with the preservation of the Quran, and that was priority, okay? Up until, even Uthman's time, that was a huge priority. And we know that from the history of the Quran and the compilation of the Quran, we know that it was actually a pretty big challenge as well, and was a big, project. And because of this, there was no way they would have allowed people to, digress from that project and give priority to the compilation of a hadith, because they would have ended up mixing, the Quran and hadith together. And funny enough, there are some traditions which seem to say, for example, in our own traditions, right? We have, sometimes we say that the verse of Ghadir, in Amir al-Mu'mineen's Quran, that the book that he had, the verse of Ghadir was revealed, or I think it was Ibn Mas'ud, sorry, not Amir al-Mu'mineen, Ibn Mas'ud, if I recall. The verse of Ghadir, for example, was revealed, and it said in it, like, Amir al-Mu'mineen is the Khalifa or the Wali after me, right? But our own scholars explain that by saying, well, no, that was just his tafsir or his hadith from the Prophet or something like that. So look, there was a threat of this happening. So therefore, they say, well, this is why they did not allow for the compilation to begin. There was a ban. Remember, guys, the position we're trying to defend is that there was a official government ban. Okay, that's what they're trying to argue. Not that, Umar, for example, the second Khalifa had issue with 2 guys or 3 guys and he's told them not to write it. No, the claim is that there was a ban on writing a hadith. And I'm saying this for a reason, because I want to make a point right at the end of my next slide. Another justification is that, it's similar to the first one, is that they didn't want to occupy themselves with writing the hadith over the Quran. The Muslim community, the Khulafa, wanted them to be busy with writing down the Quran, working on writing down the Quran. Okay. A third justification some scholars have given is that actually companions didn't even know how to write. Many of the companions didn't know how to write. And, there was just not a culture of writing things down like that. Okay, which is probably true. There was no culture like that immediately after the Prophet. Some contemporary scholars have said that, as a matter of fact, they wanted to promote this idea of memory over writing. Okay, so they wanted, they wanted the community to be acquainted with the ahadith through memory. And because that was part of their culture, they said, look, why do you want to write this down? Just memorize it. Okay, learn the ahadith through memory. That's also one justification. Another justification they give is that, look, at that time, the Muslim world was expanding. Okay, there was wars going on. Muslims were expanding all the way, to Persia and Syria and wherever else. And, that was a much more important task than to, busy themselves with writing down the ahadith. As we know, many, senior companions of the Prophet were participating in these wars, who would have been, figures that would have also narrated ahadith. They wouldn't have had time to write down books of ahadith. They were busy fighting in the wars. And one justification that, the Ahlul Sunnah scholars, I don't want to say all of them, but, some of them have said, is that, look, the companions, or at least the khulafa, they banned the writing of ahadith because the Prophet was just a human at the end of the day. And not everything he said was necessarily, legal rulings or speaking about, theological statements. No, he could have said things, out of emotions. He could be angry. He could be upset. He could have just said some stuff that has, no relevance for anyone. And because they couldn't differentiate that at all times, they were scared that, look, if you just write down anything you ever heard from him, that's going to cause mass confusion. Because there are things that he said that have no bearing on the larger Muslim community. I don't know, maybe he says one day, like, give me a glass of cold water. And somebody writes that down. Oh, today the Prophet said, give me a glass of cold water. Tomorrow, someone's going to think this is like mustahab or something. I'm just giving this. I just made up that example, by the way. But I'm saying this was their idea, and in real, maybe the Prophet just was feeling hot that day and he wanted cold water. So how do we differentiate these things? And therefore there was this, a ban basically in place. So these are some of the justifications that the Ahlul Sunnah scholars have given. What do the Shi'i scholars have to say? Okay. By the way, there's a book, right? The prohibition of the recording of the hadith. I think that's the name of it in English. You can find it on alislam.org by Sheikh Shahrastani. It's in English. It's been translated. I think it's published by Ansariyan, the publishers. And you can go. That book has all the details as well. But these are the reasoning that I believe he also mentions in that book at the end as well. General discussions, the general reasoning that the Shi'i scholars give is that, look, number one, first and foremost, there was a conspiracy and an agenda to suppress the merits of the AhlulBayt. Okay, that is something you will find amongst the Shi'i scholars who believe there was a ban, that this was one of the major reasons, why the ban was in place. A second reason why they say is that, look, the khulafa, wanted to close the door of anyone being able to object to them. And, that would have led to their embarrassment. Because, for example, they would have made certain decisions and someone could have quoted a hadith and said, well, look, this is what the Prophet said. Prophet said you're not supposed to do this. That would have caused them embarrassment. They would have lost credibility and so on. So to wrap up and close the door to these type of objections, they said, okay, let's just ban it and nobody can call us out. And a third explanation that they give is that the khulafa wanted to place themselves as the source of emulation, source of taqlid. They wanted to become basically the mujtahid, the marja, an individual that you refer to for legislation. Okay, when they give a command, when they legislate a command, then the community has to follow them. It doesn't matter what the Prophet said. Okay, we are the ones now who have taken over the role of the Prophet. Now, guys, I just want to mention, these are only, whether the Sunni justifications or the Shia justifications, these are all analysis of history. There's nowhere where it says, in the books of like the akhbar or the hadith, or in the books of history, that, okay, Abu Bakr or Umar is saying, I'm banning a hadith because I want to suppress the merits, or I'm banning a hadith because, I want to promote memory over writing. These are all analysis done by the scholars and the historians themselves. Okay, so I just want you guys to know this. And the reason why I'm saying this is because someone can come and analyze this situation, this phenomenon again, and give certain other justifications for it as well, as we will see, and I'll mention right at the end of this slide. Once again, the general, popular opinion that says that there was a ban on hadith, what do they say? They say, look, this had a certain impact on the hadith sciences, the phenomenon of hadith. They say that, look, it led to so many disputes and turmoil and fitna and different ideological views in the Muslim community. They said the reason for that was because they didn't have anything to fall back to. They had no statements that they could refer to. Another thing that happened is they, there eventually popped up a heavy focus on qiyas, analogical reasoning. One of the places where you do qiyas, or one of the reasons why you do qiyas, is when you don't have a nas, when you don't have a report from the Prophet or a hadith. It's at that point you begin to feel the need that, okay, I need to just figure it out myself, okay, with my intellect or something, because there's no statement that I have over here. If you had a statement, if you didn't ban the hadith, maybe you would have found a report by the Prophet discussing this issue, okay? Thirdly, you now didn't have a very clear criteria to measure, the truth, because somebody may narrate something, somebody may give a fatwa. There were no prophetic words, as many as there should have been, because of the ban by which we can measure the truth, okay? Second last point is that it obviously opens up the room for fabrications. Anyone can come and fabricate anything, and how are you gonna know? How are you gonna know, right? And the last one that I want to mention, and from this point I'm gonna make a counterpoint to all of what I've said so far, is that the Western Orientalists have also attacked the hadith because of this very reason. Because when the Orientalists, when they began studying hadith, in the 18th, 19th century, they came to realize, oh wow, these Muslims themselves are acknowledging that there was a ban. If there was a ban and they didn't start writing this until like 100 Hijri, 100, not even 100 was just the beginning, like 140, 150, 130 Hijri we're talking about, then what was happening, like that's 100 years, that's a whole century worth of, a missing piece of puzzle. And that's when they started coming up with their theories of, oh, the Muslims were just back projecting. Okay, so let's say the Muslims of Kufa or Basra, when they narrate a hadith or when they write on a hadith, their scholars were just back projecting on the prophetic society. Okay, so if you see hadith in the works of, the Sunnis or wherever, the merits of eating, I don't know, onions or something, the merits of eating onions. This is, I'm telling you how the Orientalists would have looked at it at that time. That if you find a hadith talking about the merits of onion, you know what? This guy was probably an onion seller. He wanted to increase his business. And he's like, okay, let me just make up a hadith and say, oh, the Prophet would say, whoever eats an onion, on Friday will go to heaven or something. So like the Orientalist critique was that, look, because there was no hadith, anyone could have come and said anything. And they began reading their current times onto the prophetic community. Because there was a ban and there was no hadith, there was no literature, and so on. Over here, I just want to mention, and I haven't even written it on the slides because, this is not a very popular opinion yet. But I just want to mention that, look, there are Muslim scholars who believe that, look, there was no ban in place. Okay, there was no ban. One of the most important works is by Muhammad Mustafa Azmi, who just passed away, I think, three years ago. He wrote his PhD thesis called Studies in Hadith Literature. Okay, Studies in Hadith Literature. It is actually a critique on the Orientalists. Okay, and he proves that, look, there was no ban. Not only was there no ban, but for 100 years, you had companions and the tabi'een that came after them who had, books, like, treaties and compilations. They had them. And he, brings a very long, bibliography of them as well. He even quotes Imam Ali. Like Imam Ali had a book. And, we know that from our own sources as well. He had a book. Okay, so he says, look, all these people had books. So what do you mean there was a ban? And, this becomes very important at that time for us to also, defend and critique back the Orientalists, especially, this revisionist view that, oh, they were just back projecting. They were just like, imitating, the times that they were living in and just making stuff up. And also from certain Shia scholars who also don't agree with this, they say, look, the reports that mention that, for example, Umar prevented someone, or Abu Bakr burnt 500 ahadith. That's one of the famous reports. He says they say that none of this proves that there was an official government ban. Look, there's a difference between saying Umar came and he told Ibn Mas'ud, don't compile ahadith. Maybe Umar had a personal vendetta against Ibn Mas'ud. Okay, he had issues with certain individuals. But you can't take a report, against Ibn Mas'ud. He even had an issue with Abu Huraira. Abu Huraira he had an issue with. But you can't say that his issue with one or two or even let's say 6, 7 people that he would have probably prevented from writing down a hadith, that this was now an official government policy. Okay, you get what I'm saying? This is why I mentioned that. Look, these are analysis. This is another counter analysis, saying how does this prove that there was a government ban? And why don't we see any traces of this ban after Umar? How come there's no reports from Uthman and Muawiyah and Abdul Malik bin Marwan and all the way to the 100 Hijris of we don't see anything like that there was a persistent on this ban. We don't see anything. Secondly, they say that if they wanted to suppress the merits of the AhlulBayt, then they would have just done that. What does that have to do with the rest of the prophetic ahadith? Okay, you have the ahadith of the Prophet, and amongst those ahadith you have the merits of the AhlulBayt. Then if that was meant to be banned, then they would have just banned that. Why the whole, why all the ahadith? What does that have to do with anything? So, this is like one of the other responses. And as I said, this is up until today, it's not a very popular view amongst the Shia scholars, but we have Shia scholars who have argued against this. That they say, look, there does not seem to be a ban. Okay, so what did Umar bin Abdul Aziz do? Umar bin Abdul Aziz, if you go read Muhammad Mustafa Azmi's book, he explains it. He said, look, Umar bin Abdul Aziz didn't say start writing a hadith for the first time after 100 Hijri. No, he was talking about compiling musannafat, like actual books. Okay, that did not exist for the first 100 years. And we know that. Okay, we know that. But not that no one ever had a small booklet or a treatise where they had a hadith all over the place, mixed with no specific theme or anything like that. So, I just wanted to mention that out. But the reason why I covered the first 2 slides is because it's actually the mainstream view. I wanted you to know what they're arguing, what they're saying. Even as I said, even the Sunnis agree with this. But I wanted to also mention this counter argument, and it's something to worth, look into and think about as well. So hopefully that covers, that discussion for now. Now, so far, what is the role of the Shia scholarship and the Imams basically up until now? So, we know, I don't have to explain this, but we know that the Shi'i sort of community really started to develop around the time of Imam, around the end of Imam Baqir alayhi salam's life, and also then obviously Imam Sadiq alayhi salam onwards. And it's at this time you begin to see a proper, development of Shia hadith. Because now, for the first time, you had actual, very loyal companions coming in. Students were, students of the Imams. And, you find many reports around this time where Imam Sadiq, for example, is telling his companions, look, write down the hadith, write them down. You're going to need them. Okay. And he's even complaining sometimes. He's saying, why are you not writing down a hadith? He gets upset at some of the companions. And from this period onwards, all the way till the Ghaiba, what you ended up, finding is that companions from Imam Baqir onwards, all the way to, let's say Imam al-Askari, or before that even a little bit, you ended up having works called the Asal, the Usul. And they say there were 400 of these Asals. Asals, now there's all this discussion on what was an Asal. Okay. What we know is that it was definitely a sort of a small book. Okay, it doesn't have to be small, but like a booklet or something, right? Which contained ahadith. Okay, this is the bare minimum that we know. There were compilations that had ahadith. Now there are different theories. Like, were these books something that the author of the hadith heard directly from the Imam? Was it are there class notes? Or were they, for example, heard from a meeting, the guy heard it from a student of Imam, there's all these different the point is that these were compilations of hadith. They had hadith in them. And from the 16 asls that we have today, we only have 16 left. Now, the rest of them get lost. No, they were compiled. The 16 that we have today, you can tell that there's no sort of theme to them.
Assalamu alaikum, brother. The sound was breaking out pretty badly, and you're on mute now, so we can't hear you. There is no audio.
Sorry, can you guys hear me now?
A lot better, alhamdulillah. We can hear you now, but you're on mute again.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, it keeps going on mute.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can hear me?
Yes, alhamdulillah. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know, it just gave me a notification. Okay, so the mics, I took out my other mic, so maybe that was because of that. Okay. So I was just talking about this idea of an asl, that there were compilations by these companions and these followers, they were Shia basically, these scholars and transmitters, who had written down these books of hadith where, they were not in any specific, they did not follow any specific theme necessarily, right? So you had mixtures of hadith in these asls, like you'll have one hadith about salat, the next one will be about Sawm. What happened is by the time, 3rd century, 4th and 5th century, when you had scholars like Sheikh al-Kulaini, these very famous scholars that ended up coming, what they started to do is that they gathered all of these asls, these usul, and they, filtered through them, they analyzed them, they, did their studies on these books, and they compiled an actual book called, for example, Usul al-Kafi. Okay, Usul al-Kafi is essentially a compilation that has taken together these asls that were written during the time of the imams, and he has obviously filtered through them. He's made sure that he's put in the ones that he found reliable, and then he published it as a book, Usul al-Kafi. Likewise, some of the other books that were written at that time, they were making use of these asls that existed during the times of the imams, written by their companions, written by their students. Around that time, after the ghaiba, in the minor occultation, in ghaiba sughra, and also in the ghaiba kubra, primarily initially in the ghaiba sughra, you had this school developing in Qom and also then in Baghdad. Okay, in Qom you had a very strong Shi'i presence. Okay, you had scholars, you had students and teachers and hadith transmitters and so on. And then eventually by 4th and 5th century, also Baghdad began to also grow, to the point where you had two very clear-cut schools in Qom and Baghdad, schools of hadith. They had studies on hadith, that you also had conflicts between these two schools, two Shi'i schools in Qom and Baghdad. Primarily this conflict came because of the methodologies used for accepting traditions and also interpreting them. Okay, if you want to see the best example of this conflict being manifested, you guys need to read Sheikh Saduq's book called The Shi'i Creed, Al-I'tiqadat, which is translated on Al-Islam as well in English, and the Tashih, the correction of the Shia Creed by Sheikh Al-Mufid, okay, who was around that, after Sheikh Saduq basically. And you can see how Sheikh Saduq says something, but Sheikh Mufid critiques him. And you can tell that this criticism is coming from Sheikh Mufid saying to Sheikh Saduq that, look, you didn't understand this hadith, or you're relying on certain ahadith which, I don't find them to be reliable. So that is a very good example of how these two different schools were, treating the ahadith literature. Okay. So you had these, so around this time you had many books that were written and compiled in 4th, 5th century. After 5th century Hijri, I'm talking about Hijri, it kind of like slowly, died down a little bit until you get to the 10th century Hijri. And that's when the Akhbari movement began, primarily around that time. And, once again, you had a new wave of, large hadith compilations, okay? In the next slide, we're going to mention some of these, compilations. So let's go to the next slide so we don't waste too much time on this one. So, on the next 2 slides is just a chart. So if you look at it, you can see that, these are some of the most important Shi'i books. So the first, the first couple of rows is basically up until, 5th century. So you have, for example, Al-Mahasin. This was written, very early. But the 4 ones in bold are what the Shia consider to be the 4 canonical texts. Okay, the 4 most important texts that we have, which is Usul al-Kafi, Man la yahduru al-Faqih, we just call it Al-Faqih, by Sheikh Saduq. And you have 2 books from Sheikh Tusi called Tahdhib al-Ahkam and Al-Istibsar. And you can see the number of ahadith in them as well, approximately how many that are in there. And also the, explanation, like what did it contain? So Usul al-Kafi has everything, okay, from theology to law to ethics, history, everything. The next 3 that we have are primarily books of law. They're fiqh works, okay? Then you have, so you come down to that 10th, 11th Hijri, which I was mentioning, the Akhbari movement began. You have Faith Kashani's Al-Wafi. And you also have Wasail al-Shia being written by Sheikh Hur al-Amili. And again, these were primarily, they were collecting from those previous 4 books that I mentioned, 4 or 5 books, and also any other book that, they would come across at their own time, that they felt that, look, if I don't compile this book in my collection right now, this may get lost. The book may get lost. So let me just preserve it in my book. And then likewise, you continue on, you have, Bihar al-Anwar. Bihar al-Anwar was specifically a project for this very reason, where he says that, look, Allama Majlisi says that, look, I'm writing this book because there's so many books out there that are just on the verge of getting destroyed and being lost. So let me just compile everything in this one huge, sort of encyclopedia, which is published right now in 110 volumes. Now, it's not that all 110 volumes have actual ahadith in them. No, that's not the case. For example, the last 2-3 volumes are just like ijazat. Ijazat were like, let's say like letters written by scholars allowing, their students to narrate ahadith and that kind of stuff. But, for the most part, it is, a collection of historical reports, ahadith, legal ahadith, historical ahadith. Even from the Sunni books, he brings a lot of stuff. And he also has his own explanations and commentary, every now and then he will mention, Allama Majlisi will mention some of these things. So they say there's around 85,000 ahadith in this book. You have Mustadrak al-Wasail, you have Jami' al-Ahadith of Ayatollah Burujardi, recent, last century basically. And also Mizan al-Hikmah by Ayatollah Ray Shahri and his team, which is published also in English as Scales of Wisdom. So, that has around 23,000 ahadith, and it's also a collection primarily, it's ethical ahadith. So that's that. Now we're going to end with these last 2 slides. So we can do Ilm al-Rijal next week. Is that what was the genre of hadith? Okay, what were the different genre of these compilations? And primarily we'll talk about Shia, but Sunnis also had these these themes. There were a couple of types of hadith compilations that began during the time of Imam Rida alayhi salam, and then they kept over the time they got more creative, and you'll see when I mention some of these. One genre of hadith was comprehensive collections. Comprehensive collection, just like the 4 books of the Usul al-Kafi, the ones that I just mentioned. Okay, they were the compilations and compilations of all the previous works that were written by previous students and previous scholars, and this scholar collected it and made it into a comprehensive encyclopedia. Okay, and they have different topics in them, organized and everything. Okay, so you have this genre. Then you had like thematic and creative sort of books, and amongst our scholars, Sheikh Saduq is known for this. Okay, he'll pick a theme and then he'll just write a whole book on it, hadith compilation on it. For example, Kitab al-Tawheed of Saduq. He picks the topic of Tawheed and then he compiles all the hadith on Tawheed in that one book. Okay. Or, he was also like, let's say, creative, like he'll say like Al-Khisal. Al-Khisal is a book which talks about, the qualities, different number of qualities, and he'll the compilation is an order of numbers, like any hadith that mentions one quality. Okay, so for example, hadith say the quality of a mu'min is that he prays or something. Because it's one, then he'll mention it in the one section. Then he says, okay, any hadith that mentions 2 qualities, and so on, like 5 qualities, 10, all the way to like 1,000. Okay, some hadiths mention like 1,000 qualities or something. So that's a very creative way of compiling a hadith book. So Sheikh Saduq was known for that. A third genre of hadith compilation were dictations. Okay, the amali as they call them. I believe only one of them is translated. Sheikh Mufid's Al-Amali is translated. It's on Al-Islam as well. What was this? This was essentially a scholar sitting, on a table or wherever they would sit, and he would dictate the hadiths and the students will write them down. And it's very interesting, like the student will also write down, okay, Sheikh Mufid or Sheikh Saduq narrated this hadith to us today on this date while we were sitting in, I don't know, Mashhad, Imam Rida's shrine. Because it's interesting to see like where they were sitting, where this was being dictated. A musnad is another genre, which is a compilation of hadith which is attributed to one individual. So for example, Sunnis have a lot of this, right? Musnads of, I don't know, Ahmad ibn Hanbal. All the hadiths that are being narrated by Ahmad bin Hanbal will be called a musnad. In Shi'i works, for example, you can say Uyun al-Akhbar al-Rida of Sheikh Saduq as well, right? All the hadiths that are from Imam Rida alayhi salam, you can say it's a musnad. It's kind of like a musnad in that case. Fiqh al-Hadith. Fiqh al-Hadith are compilation of hadith. It's a book or it's a genre of hadith which compile traditions that had to do with explaining other ahadith. And the best example that we have for this in our books is called Ma'ani al-Akhbar, the meanings of the akhbar. This is also Sheikh Saduq's book, okay, where he brings ahadith in which companions come and ask to the Imam, oh, what did you mean by this other ahadith when you use this word? Okay, and the Imam comes and explains it. Or it doesn't have to be just ahadith either, but you get the point, like it's ahadith which are explaining other things. Obviously, you had the tafsir genre, and tafsir at that time, especially in the olden days, it was basically just ahadith. Like you have an ayah and you have all the ahadith that have to do with that verse. We'll finish off with this slide, inshallah, today. You had the ahadith on, you had the genre of theology. Okay, so for example, Kamaluddin or Kitabul Ghaiba, there are multiple books on the occultation of the Imam Mahdi alayhi salam, right? This is a theological discussion. Many Shias were writing about this, or even other sort of discussions on theology could have been, part of this genre. Books on merits, Fadail, the Fadail, could be Fadail of Amir al-Mu'mineen, could be Fadail of anything, okay, any of the companions or the Imams or the Prophet and so on. Many times these were written for polemical purposes, for debates and so on. You had books of history. Okay, Kitab al-Irshad is of Sheikh Mufid, also translated into English. Very good example of this, right? You had, it's a book of history, but it's just ahadith, not always ahadith, but you can tell like there's a lot of ahadith in there as well. You had the compilation of ziyarat and du'as. Okay, these are also ahadith from the Imams or from the Prophet. You have Kamil al-Ziyarat, also translated into English. You had Sheikh Tusi's books. You had other books dedicated just for this purpose. You had ahadith books, which were, what we would call today Ilm al-Rijal books. Ilm al-Rijal in the sense that these are books that compile ahadith in which the Imams are speaking about different individuals. So the Imam would say, oh, this individual, he's not trustworthy. That individual, he will be with us in heaven, for example. So these type of narrations. And finally, obviously, you had the books on ethics and so on. You have books compiling basically ethical traditions and so on. So I think that should be enough for today. We've gone around 50 minutes. Sorry, I don't know what had happened to my mic, but hopefully everything else was clear, inshallah.
Yep, that's okay. Thank you very much, brother. Jazakallah khair. That was very informative and it was very easy to grasp. If you have a few more minutes for Q&A, if that's okay.
Yeah, I'm fine. Yeah.
So the first question we have is a triadic question. What is the value, and I don't know if we've delved deep enough for this question, what is the value of unverified or unauthentic or unreliable hadiths? I know they're different terms and they mean different things. Do they have a value? The question is assuming they obviously have a value.
So look, I think because I'm going to discuss this specifically in over the next 2 sessions, because look, first we have to define by what do you mean by unauthentic? Like I'm guessing they mean like it's not sahih. That's probably what they're translating. Let me explain in the next session or next or second or third session what this even means. And then we'll be able to, because I actually have a one slide just on this. You know, what do we mean? Like, what's the value of this hadith? You know? So yeah, we do believe that you can have a hadith, just to answer very briefly, we do believe that you can have a hadith which is not authentic in its chain, but it still has value. And as a matter of fact, you may even believe that it is 100% correct and can be attributed to the Prophet or the Imam. It's very, very much possible.
Okay. The second question also kind of ties in to the previous one. Is there a consistent or universal classification or grading method for hadiths? And I don't know if that's more of like al-murajal or ad-diraya kind of thing, because it is about the jargon used to classify the hadiths.
So look, if they mean by classifying like the terminologies, yeah, more or less. No. So look, we have differences between even in the terminologies between the Shia and the Sunni. Sometimes like they will call something marfu'. They have one meaning for it, but we have a different meaning for it. So keep that aside. But yeah, within the Shi'i understanding, you know, sahih has a specific definition. Da'if has a specific definition. So the definitions, we don't have too much ikhtilafat, too much differences on that. Yes, what a scholar considers to be sahih or da'if or whatever, yes, obviously that's going to be, because that at the end of the day, that's a scholar's ijtihad at that point. So you will have certain scholars who are very strict. Okay, so their criteria for considering something sahih is going to be super strict. Some of them are going to be lenient, you know, based on their ijtihad, based on their understanding and scholarship. And therefore, you know, you may have certain individuals, you know, that may consider a lot of certain hadiths to be authentic that another person may say this is fabricated. You know, that much, even sometimes you can have a difference. So yeah, I don't think there's necessarily a universal criteria to say like everyone will say this is authentic, unless it's like tawatur, like, you know, like man kuntu mawla fa hada aliyun mawla, like no one will say this is, oh, you know, I'm so strict, I don't even believe in this. No, that's tawatur. No one's gonna have an issue over there.
I think the question was more about al-murajal, when you say someone is trustworthy.
Okay, so we'll discuss that, because al-murajal also, there's actually, yeah, like, you know what, I'm gonna have to touch on this very briefly in the session, because otherwise this is like a whole different, like it's a very extensive thing. Like, what do we do when there's differences of opinion amongst the scholars of Rijal themselves? What do you do then? Okay, Sheikh Tusi says something, Sheikh Najashi says something else. Tusi says this person is da'if, Sheikh Najashi says he's thiqa, right? So what do you do? There are obviously ways to, you know, go around these, but I think that will become way too technical for something like this.
Yeah. Okay. Another question is, in terms of the different branches, whether they're 4 branches or many more, are they used in conjunction or are they used independently? Like when it comes to verifying or authenticating hadiths?
Okay, so once again, so look, by authenticating a hadith, that itself, you know, it depends. Like, what is the scholar's approach? Are they like Sayyid Khui, who just cares about the rijal, right? Just the transmitters. If it's someone like Sayyid Khui, he probably won't care too much about, you know, the history and this and that. No, he just sees the chain of narrators. He said these guys are authentic, trustworthy. We have to accept it. Ta'abbudan, like it's ta'abbud for him. But no, those who believe, and by the way, I will cover this in the next session. Those who believe that no, you need to attain a sense of conviction that these words were actually uttered by the Prophet or the Imam, then yes, you will have history playing a role. Will have fiqh al-hadith playing a role. You will have other things playing a role as well, like the ijma of the scholars, right? Did every classical scholar accept this or not? Did they give a fatwa on this or not? Many different things can come into play at that point to verify or reject that hadith.
Okay, so in terms of what happens in the hawza right now, in terms of how knowledge is imparted or disseminated, are they used in conjunction or are they like different?
Yeah, so for example, if you have a marja who's giving bahs kharij, the advanced level classes, who believes in this idea of conviction, you have to get convinced that this tradition was uttered, and they don't just look at the chain of transmitters, then yes, you will see them getting into historical discussion. Definitely. Sayyid Madadi, for example, Ayatollah Sayyid Madadi, he's one of the scholars there from the students of from the last batch of students of Sayyid Khoyi, and also from Sayyid Sistani's first batch of students. You will see him do this extensively when he discusses a hadith. He will explain all the history, where this person came from, how did he come from Kufa to Qom, this, just to see that yes, we can trust this hadith or we cannot trust this hadith.
Another question, speaking of conviction, can we ever reach yaqeen with hadiths?
Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Yeah, like in terms of the Quran, like how do we reach yaqeen?
So look, it's depends. Like, what does he mean by yaqeen? Like, conviction is a type of certainty. Like when I say convinced, it's itminan.
Yeah.
Like you have itminan that this statement was said. Yeah, if we're talking about philosophical certainty, and no, obviously not. Like that's not even, nobody even discusses that. You don't use that type of certainty anywhere in your life. But can we reach certainty and just on the type of certainty we reach on a day-to-day basis? Yeah, definitely you can. And then sometimes you won't. And the times that you don't, you have to evaluate to the degree of that conviction. Is it a very serious conviction? Like you're very, very sure about it? That's going to become hujjah on you on the day of judgment. But no, if it's like you haven't reached conviction at all, then obviously that's not hujjah. Then you can leave it aside. Yes, the deeper you get into it, the more extensive you get into it, it does become a bit more complicated. But it's not the case that you can't reach, like you can't reach any truth with the hadith. That's not a very healthy way of looking at the tradition. Yeah, do we have fabrications? Do fabrications exist? Were there problems? Of course there were. Like we know that. But that's literally what these scholars are trying to deal with.
And the final question is, are there any significant differences between Sunni and Hadith, Sunni and Shi'i, science of Hadith?
Yeah, there are some pretty significant differences. They are even the way that they formulate their beliefs based on a hadith. See, they're very much if you look at their rijal, for example, it's very, very extensive, very extensive. And there's a reason for that. The reason for that is that they are which, as I said, I will mention this in the next sessions and stuff, that they have this idea that khabar wahid, a solitary report, which is being transmitted by trustworthy individuals, that this has to be accepted. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Like it has to be accepted. You can even formulate your beliefs and aqidah based on these reports. For a Shi'i, like that's not necessarily the case. Okay, that's not necessarily the case. For example, from the beginning, our scholars would say that a khabar wahid, a solitary report, has no value when it comes to building an aqidah. Okay, so you can see this in the words of Sheikh Mufid all the time. That's one of his major critiques on Sheikh Saduq, actually. So because of that reason, they had to really focus on ilm al-rijal a lot, Sunnis. Okay, our books unfortunately were not that extensive as opposed to theirs. Also, their ilm al-diraya is a lot more extensive. Okay, they have way more terminologies than like us. Even like simple terminologies that we have, let's say sahih, they'll break the sahih into like 10 different divisions. Sahih like this, sahih al-hasan, sahih like this, so on, sahih al-mashhur. But as I said, that's like technical discussions, and that look, every group had to come up with a science by which they can cater to their source material. Okay, yeah. for our source material, we don't necessarily need, such an extensive discussion like in Ilm al-Diraya. We probably don't need such an extensive discussion. But maybe they do. But what we do have, for example, which they also have it, but it's a little bit different, is that the fiqh al-hadith that we are now starting to develop and get better in this time and age. And that is coming primarily, I would say, from the discussions in usul al-fiqh, which is legal theory, which we have a whole section on how to understand speech, how to understand statements and sentences and so on. I would say because our usul al-fiqh excels in that aspect, then that also has an impact on the way we understand our hadith. I would say it's a lot more comprehensive and a lot more extensive. In at least in that sense, we excel quite a bit.
Okay, is there a reason for that? For example, why they have more terminologies?
As I said, because I feel that their criteria was so strict. They have built themselves they've put themselves in a box where, like, look, this is the only type of hadith that needs to be accepted, and it's very chain oriented, like the chain of transmitters. It's very much oriented around that. Because of that, they have to make sure they filter anything out that is even like a little bit suspicious. I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example. When I was young, I was like 14, 15. I was still learning ilm al-rijal and stuff. And a Salafi came to me, and not to me, like to a group of people. He said, and I was there listening. He said, why don't you prove to me that Hinda, the wife of Abu Sufyan, chewed the liver of Hamza, the uncle of the Prophet? Like, prove it to me with a Sahih Sanad report. And I was still young, and when you go look for it in the books of history, you won't find a report with a Sahih Sanad, a chain of transmitters. And when I was young, I was like, oh my God, like, how are we believing in this? It's not even authentic. That was like a very naive me at that time. But I'm just trying to tell you that that's their mindset sometimes. Like, look, for them, even like proving an incident has to meet this, even though, by the way, they're not consistent with this. They're not consistent. But for polemical purposes, or even for their own agendas at times, or to prove a certain claim, they will bring this criteria out and say, well, prove this to me with a very strong chain. Whereas, inshallah, we'll mention in the next session or the session after that the chain is not always the ultimate criteria. Yes, can it play a role in you getting conviction? Definitely it can play. Does play a role. Definitely plays a role. But is it the ultimate criteria that if the chain is weak and then that's it, like you cannot accept the hadith? Obviously not. I don't, as I said, like outside of fiqh, because in fiqh you have this ikhtilaf, but outside of fiqh, no Shia scholars, I don't know of any Shia scholar that ascribes to this approach at all.
Okay, that's it for the questions for tonight. If you have any final words before we end.
No, inshallah. So I just inshallah, you can pass on the feedback for today's session, and so I can want to make any improvements and stuff for the next session,
inshallah. If anyone has any feedback, also you can either message our Instagram or our Facebook page, and inshallah we'll see you again next week on Wednesday, on the 1st of July at 9 p.m. اللهم أخرجنا من ظلمات الوهم وأكرمنا بنور الفهم. اللهم افتح علينا من أبواب رحمتك وانشر علينا من خزائن علومك برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين.